Yeah, so this work is from my doctorate at the University of Washington. I'm actually now at University of Texas Institute for Geophysics, just starting there. And I've had a lot of help with the stuff I'm going to show today, but in particular, just want to point out William Wilcock, Joan Gomberg, and Parker McCready for their input. Okay, so I think most of my talk has kind of already been covered by the previous talks, so might jump around a bit and won't spend too much time belaboring anything. But just to remind everyone, I want to talk a bit about slow slip. For those who aren't, don't think about this stuff all the time. So here we have a cross section of a subduction zone with the subducting plate moving down to our left and the overriding plate on top here. And basically this red zone marked here as the seismogenic zone. Oops, I see how everyone's doing that now. This is where we get our large damaging earthquakes. And there's been lots of work in a number of settings, down dip or deeper from this zone, that show these what we call slow slip events, where instead of having earthquake slip that happens over seconds with lots of shaking, you have this slip that occurs over days to weeks to months, maybe even years in some cases, and with no discernible shaking. And I will skip over this other than just to say that on land, so here we're looking at Washington State, so in the Cascadia subduction zone, this is just one example of slip modeling for one of these events. And you can just see like how well these things can be characterized with the colors corresponding to slip rates per day. You can kind of watch this thing evolve through time. Obviously a lot harder to do in the ocean, which has been talked about a number of times. We just don't have the resolution out there. But if you have a GPS station on land and you see one of these things, you essentially see this secular strain signal as the overriding plate is dragged along with the subducting plate, and then periodically some of that's recovered. And so you kind of get these ramps or series of ramps as these slow slip events occur. Okay, so in more recent years, say the past decade or so, a bit longer, I guess now, there have been various efforts that have shown slow slip to also occur on the shallowest portion of the subduction zone out under the sea surface. And for, again, reasons that have been kind of covered in previous talks, a lot of our traditional on-land methods don't work or require kind of special modifications to work in the ocean. Okay, but one tool we do have that works well on the seafloor is bottom pressure. And so just quickly, I have a little cartoon here. You can imagine some pressure sensor on the seafloor. That's going to record a pressure that's just rho GH. And that'll be affected by the height of the water as waves, for instance, pass through. It'll be affected by changes in density of the water column. But also if the seafloor moves up or down, that's going to generate a signal that will be recorded on that pressure sensor. The question is just, can we resolve that signal? And so here we just have an example. This is real data. I just use hectopascal and centimeters of water kind of equivalently as others have. And the black time series in the background is before removing the tides. And then the blue is just if you do a simple low pass tidal filter. Okay, so I've just moved that picture to the corner here. And this is our goal, at least for me. If there's some slip signal in there, in this case, we have this nice ramp in the middle of the time series. We want to be able to pull that out and separate it from all this other stuff. And based on the studies that have been done in various settings, particularly Japan and New Zealand, we kind of expect the amplitude of these things to be centimeter scale. If we're lucky, maybe approaching 5 or 6 centimeters, but certainly smaller than that as well. So these are, really quite small. And we're going to move from the kind of upper left panel here down to the lower right. I mentioned you can move the tides. You can kind of use these fitting codes. You can low pass filter. I'm not going to focus too much on that. Other people are talking about this instrumental drift effect. I'm really going to focus on these last two components, seasonal and kind of subseasonal variation. And if we look at these figures in comparison to kind of what we're after, you kind of get a sense of the problem, right? These are very large signals compared to the size of the thing we're trying to pull out. So I'm going to talk about a couple of data sets, and just for simplicity, I'm going to kind of merge the work I've done in the two, but just to kind of point to where this data is coming from. On the left here, we have the 2018 to 2019, Alaska Community Seismic Experiment with the triangles, the colored, I should say, the infilled triangles representing the stations that have pressure records. On the right-hand side here, we have the Cascadia Initiative Experiment, again, with these various shapes representing where we have pressure records. And with both of these, I really just want to emphasize the scale of these deployments, right? These are really large aperture arrays. And that will kind of come back in a second here. Okay, so if we look at the data, here I have, I think it's the first year of the Cascadia Initiative Experiment. It doesn't really matter. And I have applied a low-pass filter to remove the tides. I have just done a simple exponential plus linear fit to remove instrumental drift. And you can see, in some cases where maybe that didn't work so well. And then I've just plotted these kind of from north to south as they line up in the map, using color coding to show kind of where they are in terms of water depth, right? So the light green colors are on or near the shelf, really shallow. As you get to the darker blue, you're moving out into deep water. And for me, something that jumped out that I wasn't necessarily expecting is that these sensors at comparable depths seem to have, really high coherence, even over large distances. And so to kind of cut to the chase, here on the right-hand side, I'm plotting two stations just from an arbitrary year of this deployment. And what I've shown here is a separation between the two sensors of over 100 kilometers, and both deployed at about 120 meters depth, so pretty shallow. And again, sorry about that. We can see that, again, I've removed the tides and instrumental drift from these, and we start with something that for both of these observations have an RMS over this deployment period of about 3 centimeters. And if we just subtract one from the other, which I have in the lower panel here in black, we go to something that's sub-centimeter RMS. So a really significant improvement. And again, these are separated by 100 kilometers. And so we can do this for all different kinds of pairs of stations in Cascadia. And we kind of come up with these parameters around, essentially, you have to match the depth between two stations to kind of get this coherence. And depending on how shallow the stations are, kind of the level of that depth matching has to be more or less strict. So up on the shelf or near the shelf break, you get to be within 10 meters or a few tens of meters. And then as you go out into deeper water, you can be pretty loose in your definition of having a matched depth. But again, these relationships are occurring over distances of hundreds of kilometers. And in this particular experiment, really these limitations on separation were limitations of the network itself, not things that popped out of the analysis. It's just there weren't sensors that were further than 100 or 300 kilometers apart. So it's really pretty remarkable. Just to kind of jump to the chase on some of the other work, I'm just repeating the table from Cascadia, although a little bit simplified on the left here. In the center is what we were able to find out of Alaska. Then on the right is work that's been done in Hikurangi, as summarized by NOE et al. 2021, who gave one of the pre-recorded talks yesterday. And so we see very similar kind of results in each of these three settings. So we're looking at the Eastern Pacific, kind of up north in Alaska, and then over in the Southern Hemisphere on the Western Pacific with Hikurangi. So seeing results where we're getting down to something on the order of a centimeter RMS, a little noisier in Alaska. And as long as you kind of, sufficiently match your depths, again, each of these settings, it's all kind of limited by the size of the network, particularly Hikurangi was a smaller aperture network. We're seeing at least comparable patterns across these settings over really large distances when we have the data available. So another thing we did in Alaska is we had additional data and we explored the viability of other proxies. So this is just one example of a shelf pressure record from that experiment. In blue, I've just repeated that original pressure record, 5 times or whatever it is. And then in red, I plotted each of these proxies. So the first being the incoming plate pressure record, which is kind of the traditional method for correcting for these kinds of studies. The second being this so-called depth match pressure record. The third was something we developed called the network average pressure, where we essentially took all of the pressure records on the shelf, normalized them, averaged them, rescaled them Similarly for the slope, all the records on the slope, normalized them, averaged them, rescaled them, and applied that as a proxy. Then we also looked at co-located temperatures and sea surface height from satellite altimetry, and scaled those appropriately to try to minimize the RMS of the residuals. And so on this right-hand side is what we get when we subtract out each of these proxies from the pressure record. And we can see, oops, I thought a circle was going to pop up. We can see that these, the depth match pressure and then also the network average pressure, both of which are kind of exploiting this along isobath coherence, are the most effective methods. Another technique that we use that I won't go into detail, that's also been mentioned by some of the other speakers, are using these complex EOFs, which for the other kind of seismology, geodesy people in the room, very similar to principal component analysis. You're basically just finding basis functions that describe your data set. And these are the data from Alaska. In blue are the observed pressures on the shelf. On the right are the observed pressures on the slope. And the red curves, are the first mode for each of those two groups respectively. So, even just at a quick look at this, you can see that that first mode describes a lot of the variation here. And we kind of use this to correct both seasonal and subseasonal variation in these signals. Okay, I'm going to kind of go quick through here because I'm starting to run short on time. But just wanted to point out that this is essentially a results where we did a sinusoidal seasonal correction and then applied each of the proxies I talked about earlier. And we're looking at the RMS for each of these corrections and each of these shelf stations kind of along the x-axis here. And so the height of these bars just is representing how effective each of these proxies are for reducing the RMS in each case. And just to kind of cut to the chase, the pressure, the match depth, reference pressure, and the average network pressure in every case are giving you the best result. And then this is just to show that in using this CEOF method, you're removing a seasonal and subseasonal step. So you're getting the majority of your correction between this dashed line and the solid line. That represents that CEOF correction. But then in certain cases, you can get additional correction by also doing these kind of match depth proxies. Okay, so after we've corrected the data in this way, the question remains, okay, yes, the RMS is lower, but what kind of SSE can we actually detect from these data? And so I'm just going to come back to this picture. And you can see how like a single number of the RMS, doesn't necessarily tell you the whole picture, right? We're looking for something that's ramp-like or step-like. We have this signal here. We have maybe an upward ramp here, some kind of spike here, right? So how much are these going to cause problems for us? And so there's kind of two ways I've gone about that. In Cascadia, did some synthetic, did some modeling with some forward models where considered a range of slip scenarios kind of between magnitude 6 and 7, variable distance from the shore, change the stress drop. And then we used output from a regional oceanographic model to create a synthetic data set and add the deformation into that data set. And this is just one example model, which resulted in kind of peak uplift in this red set of contours of about 5.5 centimeters and peak subsidence in these blue contours of about 4.5 centimeters. And so what we did is we set up two station lines, one kind of being these, at the time, what was a fairly typical type of pressure sensor deployment, kind of going along the shelf. And so you're going to have kind of a large change in depth across this. And in here from the starred location moving towards the shore, we have each of the pressure records, which has been, from which we've subtracted out the starred location, right? So we're using that as our kind of proxy correction. And in the red are plotted those stations that fall within this kind of bold uplift contour, which represents 15 millimeters of uplift, and plotted in blue are those that fall within the contours of 15 millimeters of subsidence. And so you can see that as you start crossing these isobaths, the correction, as I've kind of pointed out, stops working, and it's really hard to pick out this signal. On the other hand, if we have this long strike constant isobath line of stations, the picture is very different, and it's really easy to pick out that signal, arguably even outside of kind of the region I've highlighted. Okay, so I'm not going to worry about that. The other way we've gone about this in the Alaska study was instead of trying to generate a range of slip scenarios, we instead said, let's just put various levels of deformation into the time series and try to detect them back out. And so we're not worrying about kind of how the slip is distributed in the network, but just if you have deformation on a single station, can you actually detect it? And there's two ways you can envision doing that. One would be kind of what I think of as like the Hikarangi model, where they have really good onshore GNSS data. They know where to look and when to look. So that's like represented by the left-hand side, known onset. You can also imagine when you're somewhere like Cascadia or Alaska and you don't know where or when to look, you're going in totally blind. So that's the unknown onset side. And so each of these is just showing for the various proxies we considered, the corrected time series with some deformation step put in it. And then the solid kind of curves here are the detectors for kind of assessment of where the slip is and how large it is. And you can see that when you give it the known time, then yeah, of course, they're all going to get the timing right, but they'll predict various amplitudes depending on the quality of the correction. On the right-hand side, they'll sometimes get the timing wrong. And again, the amplitude will depend. Okay, so this is just for the unknown onset on the shelf. And I guess the thing I forgot to mention is we threw in a bunch of these deformations, again, just one at a time, but through all different times, all different sizes, different durations, et cetera. So we kind of come up with these composite results. And so that's what I have here in these histograms or the composite results there. And so just looking for unknown onset time on the shelf, on the left-hand plots, we have the timing results for just an example, 2, 6, and 10 centimeter uplift size. And then on the right-hand plots are the recovered amplitude for those. And just to, again, cut to the chase here, through this work, we found that using the CEOF correction or, a sinusoidal correction, plus exploiting these along isobath pressure coherence, we could basically consistently get the timing and amplitude right on the shelf at around 4 centimeters and above. And on the slope, we could do the same for about 2 centimeters and above. If you know the timing in advance, it's a huge advantage and you can do better than this. Okay, and I'm maybe a little bit over, but I've done much worse in the past, so I'm pretty happy. I'm just going to leave it with these kind of things that are interesting to me. If they're interesting to you, we should talk later. In particular, I'm really interested in kind of what's left in the signal. Where is it coming from oceanographically? How can we understand it? Where do these distance scales start to break down? Why do they break down? Also, like, what is the noise for? What are we not correcting out? And where does that come from? And is there any way to, if not predict it, to understand it and kind of see it in the signal and know, okay, I see, signals that look this certain way, so I know it's this type of feature. All of that I think is really fascinating. Thank you.